flags still fly above London. Crowds still gather in the streets, their faces lit by relief, pride, and exhaustion. Windows glow again after years of blackout. Bells ring. Music drifts through the air. From the outside, it looks like a happy ending. A great war has been won, and the empire has survived. History often freezes here, treating victory as proof of strength and endurance. It tells a comforting story, that the British Empire fell later because the world changed, because colonies demanded freedom, because time eventually wears down every power. But this chapter opens with a harder claim. The empire did not collapse from age or idealism. It collapsed from debt, from obligations accumulated quietly, while attention stayed fixed on battlefields and speeches. While cannons thundered across Europe and Asia, another war unfolded in silence. It took place in vaults, in accounting rooms, in hurried meetings where survival mattered more than tomorrow. Britain was not fighting to preserve an empire. It was fighting to stay alive. And survival came at a price that victory could not erase. By the time peace arrived, the empire still stood on maps, but its financial core was hollowed out. Think about that. An empire that once controlled global trade routes, currencies, and capital flows suddenly owed more than it could command. The flags remained, but the leverage was gone. Power rarely vanishes in a single moment. It leaks away. It drains through interest payments, currency pressure, and dependence on others for basic stability. This chapter asks a question that reframes everything that follows. What if the British Empire did not lose its power through military defeat or colonial rebellion, but through the fine print of war finance? What if the decisive battles were fought not with tanks and ships, but with credit lines and emergency agreements? The story does not begin with collapse. It begins with desperation, with survival at any cost. And that cost would quietly decide the empire's fate. At the height of its power, Britain had been the world's banker. Its financial system sat at the center of global trade. Its currency moved easily across continents. Its institutions financed governments, railways, ports, and wars far beyond its shores. London was not just a capital city. It was a command center for money itself. That position gave Britain the kind of power armies alone could never provide. Control over finance meant control over options. But war changes the rules. Total war consumes resources faster than any empire can comfortably supply. It forces governments to spend first and worry later. Britain entered the world wars with confidence rooted in past dominance. It expected to endure as it always had. What it did not expect was how deeply war would reverse its financial position. As conflict dragged on, the costs grew beyond imagination. Ships needed fuel. Factories needed materials. Armies needed equipment, food, and transport. Every day of war burned through wealth that had taken generations to build. Gold reserves were spent to pay for imports. Overseas assets were sold quietly to raise cash. Emergency borrowing filled the gap. These were not signs of collapse. They were signs of survival, and that is what made them dangerous. Each decision made sense in the moment. Each kept the war effort alive. But together, they built a structure of obligation that would outlast the fighting itself. The public saw speeches and symbols. They heard promises of endurance and victory. What they did not see were the ledgers. They did not see how often Britain had to ask for help or how much leverage it surrendered each time it did. War finance is not neutral. Money always comes with conditions, whether written or implied. Britain accepted those conditions because it had no alternative. Losing financial independence was preferable to losing the war. That trade seemed temporary. It was not. By the time victory arrived, the world had shifted. Britain emerged exhausted, its economy strained, its reserves depleted. The empire still existed, but it no longer rested on financial strength. It rested on borrowed time. Debt had transformed the meaning of victory. Winning the war did not restore Britain's old position. It locked in a new reality, one where influence depended on creditors, where choices are constrained by balance sheets, and where every major decision carried financial consequences Britain could no longer ignore. This is the moment where the traditional story fails. Empires are often imagined as falling because they are defeated or morally challenged. But economics works differently. Debt does not announce itself with fanfare. It accumulates quietly. It narrows options without obvious drama. An indebted power can still look strong. It can still deploy forces. It can still speak confidently. But beneath the surface, it is no longer free. It must consider how actions affect currency stability, repayment schedules, and access to credit. For an empire, that loss of freedom is fatal. Control over others requires control over yourself. The British Empire entered the post-war world facing exactly this problem. Its global commitments remained vast, but its ability to fund them independently was gone. Maintaining troops overseas cost money it did not have. Supporting currencies across the empire required reserves that were already spent. Rebuilding at home competed with obligations abroad. Every choice became a trade-off. Retrenchment was no longer a political preference. It was a financial necessity. And retrenchment, once begun, is difficult to stop. Think about the psychological shift this creates. An empire accustomed to dictating terms now had to negotiate, not just with colonies, but with financial realities. Decisions once made from a position of dominance were now shaped by constraint. This is how power erodes without a single dramatic event, not through defeat, but through dependence, not through collapse, but through calculation. Britain could still act, but it had to ask what it could afford. And that question haunted every imperial decision that followed. This chapter sets a foundation for everything to come. It is not about blaming war or dismissing sacrifice. It is about understanding cost. War did not simply weaken Britain. It rewired its position in the global system. The empire survived the fighting, but it lost the financial independence that had made its power sustainable. From that moment on, decline was not inevitable, but it was heavily weighted. Recovery would require choices Britain could no longer freely make. The story ahead is not one of sudden collapse. It is one of gradual exposure, of illusions maintained while foundations erode, of an empire that appeared victorious, yet was already constrained by promises it could not escape. The war ended. The bill did not. And in that bill lay the quiet answer to why the British Empire really fell. Before the cracks became visible, the British Empire looked unbreakable. Its reach stretched across oceans and continents, linking ports, factories, plantations, and financial centers into a single imperial system. British ships moved through global sea lanes with confidence. Harbors from Asia to Africa pulsed with trade. Raw materials flowed inward, finished goods flowed outward, and profits returned to London. The empire did not just control territory. It controlled circulation. Money, goods, and information moved through channels Britain had built over generations. From the outside, this looked like permanence. It looked like a structure too large, too connected, too experienced to fail. At the center of this system sat London, not just a political capital, but a financial command room. The city's banks, insurers, and markets helped set the rhythm of global trade. Sterling moved easily across borders as a trusted currency. Contracts were written in it. Reserves were held in it. For many governments and businesses, access to British finance meant access to the world. This gave Britain a unique advantage. Power did not rely only on soldiers or ships. It rested on credibility, on trust in institutions built over centuries. That trust allowed Britain to borrow cheaply, to invest widely, and influence others without direct force. Even war did not immediately shatter this image. When global conflict erupted, Britain mobilized on a scale few nations could match. Troops were drawn from across the empire. Factories shifted to wartime production. Shipyards worked day and night. Resources were extracted from colonies and redirected toward survival. From a distance, this looked like resilience. The machinery of empire kept moving. The ports stayed busy. The armies stayed supplied. Observers saw continuity and assumed strength. But this was an illusion built on borrowing and deferred costs. Total war demands more than any economy can comfortably give. Britain's domestic production was not enough to sustain years of conflict. It needed food, fuel, metals, and machinery from abroad. Paying for those imports required hard currency and reserves. As the war dragged on, those reserves shrank. Gold that once symbolized stability was shipped out quietly to settle accounts. Overseas investments, built over decades, were sold off under pressure. These were not acts of panic. They were calculated decisions to keep the war effort alive. But each one weakened the empire's long-term position. To fill the widening gap, Britain turned increasingly to borrowing. Emergency loans replaced savings. Credit substituted for cash. Future earnings were promised to pay for present survival. In the moment, this seemed rational. The war had to be won. Everything else could be addressed later. But later would arrive with consequences attached. Borrowing does not merely provide money. It shifts relationships. It creates dependence. And it changes who sets the terms. Imagine a global empire running on credit. Imagine promising tomorrow's wealth to pay for today's battles. As long as the flags flew and the fleets sailed, this arrangement remained invisible to most people. The empire still looked intact. But beneath the surface, the rules of power were changing. Control over territory mattered less than control over finance. And Britain was slowly losing that control. The illusion held because the imperial system was vast and complex. Production continued across colonies. Goods still moved. Revenue still flowed. But much of that value could no longer be freely used. Obligations came first. Payments had to be made. Commitments had to be honored. What looked like wealth was often already spoken for. This is how financial strain hides inside apparent abundance. The empire was working harder than ever, yet retaining less of the value it generated. There was also a psychological dimension to the illusion. Britain had been dominant for so long that decline seemed unthinkable. Leaders and citizens alike believed endurance was a national trait. Temporary hardship was acceptable if it preserved long-term status. War was framed as a test that Britain had passed before and would pass again. That mindset delayed difficult questions. How much could the empire afford to maintain? What was the true cost of global commitments? These questions were pushed aside in favor of immediate survival. The world wars accelerated trends already underway. Other industrial powers had grown. Global competition had intensified. Britain's relative economic weight had been declining for years. War did not create this problem, but it magnified it. The empire entered conflict with structural weaknesses and emerged with those weaknesses exposed. The illusion of strength lingered because symbols remained. Maps still showed vast territories. Ceremonies still projected authority. But symbols do not pay bills. And authority cannot be sustained without financial backing. Think about how fragile power becomes when it relies on appearances. As long as confidence holds, systems function. Once doubt enters, everything tightens. Credit becomes conditional. Markets become nervous. Choices narrow. Britain was approaching that threshold without fully realizing it. The empire still believed it could act as it always had. But the cost of action was rising, and the margin for error was shrinking. This chapter is not about sudden failure. It is about delay. About how systems can look healthy while accumulating stress. The British Empire did not appear weak in the aftermath of war. It appeared tired but intact. That appearance masked a deeper shift. Financial autonomy had been traded for endurance. Independence had been exchanged for assistance. The empire was no longer paying for power outright. It was renting it month by month, agreement by agreement. And renting power is dangerous. Rent can be raised. Terms can change. Access can be limited. Once an empire accepted arrangement, it is no longer fully sovereign in its decisions. Britain was still a great power, but it was no longer free in the way it once had been. Control over money was slipping, and with it, control over the future. This is why the coming turning point mattered so much. The illusion of strength delayed reform and obscured risk. By the time the cracks could no longer be ignored, options were already constrained. The empire had survived the wars, but had done so by mortgaging its freedom of action. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but reckoning. One driven not by ideology or rebellion alone, but by arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike myths, cannot be argued away. The turning point did not arrive with a single defeat or dramatic announcement. It arrived quietly, through a mechanism that rarely makes headlines. Debt. War transformed Britain from the world's banker into a debtor dependent on others for liquidity, supplies, and stability. This shift changed everything. Before the wars, Britain lent money to shape the world. After the wars, it borrowed money to survive within it. That reversal did not just alter balance sheets. It rewired power itself. Each loan solved an immediate problem and created a long-term constraint. Access to credit kept factories running and ships moving, but it came with limits. Decisions that once belonged solely to London now required reassurance to creditors. Currency stability mattered more than imperial ambition. Sterling, once a symbol of confidence, came under pressure. Maintaining its value demanded discipline, restraint, and sacrifice. Reserves that could have funded reconstruction or sustained overseas commitments were instead held back to defend credibility. Money stopped being a tool of expansion and became a shield against collapse. Overseas earnings tell the same story. The empire still produced enormous value. Colonies extracted raw materials, grew food, and manufactured goods at unprecedented levels. On paper, this should have restored strength. In reality, much of that value was already pledged. Earnings were earmarked for repayment before they ever reached Britain. The empire worked harder, but kept less. This is the trap of debt at scale. Productivity increases, but freedom decreases. Wealth exists, yet cannot be fully used. To maintain influence, Britain needed spending. Troops abroad required pay, supply lines, and logistics. Diplomatic presence required investment. Infrastructure across the empire demanded maintenance. But spending required borrowing, and borrowing shifted leverage away from London. Each new obligation tightened the circle. Reduce spending and authority weakens. Maintain spending and dependence deepens. There was no easy exit. The empire was trapped inside its own system. This is where cause and effect become unavoidable. Debt forced retrenchment. Retrenchment reduced authority. Reduced authority accelerated political pressure in the colonies. When independence movements gained momentum, Britain faced a dilemma. Suppressing them required resources it could not afford. Negotiating from strength required leverage it no longer possessed. The empire still had experience and institutions, but it lacked financial dominance. And without that dominance, time was no longer on its side. Think about how this changes negotiation itself. An empire in surplus can wait. An empire in deficit cannot. Every delay costs money. Every crisis risks currency instability. Britain increasingly needed calm more than control. Stability more than assertion. That need shaped decisions that might otherwise seem sudden or generous. What appears in hindsight as a political choice often began as an economic necessity. The world noticed this shift. Other powers adjusted their expectations. Markets recalculated risk. Confidence, once assumed, became conditional. Britain could still act, but every action carried consequences beyond its borders. Financial pressure turned global leadership into a balancing act. The empire could no longer absorb shocks the way it once had. Small disturbances now carried outsized effects. Short, punchy truth. Power follows money. And the money was no longer Britain's. What looks like a political unraveling was, at its core, an economic one. War debt did not merely weaken Britain. It changed how the entire system responded to British decisions. The empire crossed a line where recovery on its own terms was no longer possible. From that moment forward, decline was shaped less by choice and more by constraint. This chapter marks the real turning point. Not the end, but the irreversible shift. Once financial independence was lost, every path forward narrowed. The empire could still choose how to decline, but it could no longer choose whether to. The mechanism was set. Debt had done its work. Collapse does not always arrive with fire or finality. There was no single day when the British Empire officially ended, no dramatic announcement that closed the curtain on centuries of dominance. Instead, decline unfolded through withdrawals, Currency crises, hurried negotiations, and decisions framed as temporary but never reversed. Britain remained a nation, intact and proud, yet something fundamental had changed. It was no longer an empire that could shape the world at will. Its global role narrowed as its financial limits tightened. Power did not vanish. It contracted. Across the map, exits replaced expansions. Places once described as permanent became liabilities, measured in cost rather than prestige. Maintaining control required money Britain could not spare. Every overseas commitment competed with rebuilding at home. Social pressures rose. Domestic needs demanded attention. The balance sheet became the final authority. Independence movements accelerated not because Britain suddenly embraced new ideals, but because enforcement had become unaffordable. Control, stripped of economic backing, was no longer sustainable. Currency weakness played its part. Defending financial credibility required restraint. Spending abroad risked instability at home. Each crisis forced difficult choices, and most pointed in the same direction. Withdrawal, retrenchment, reduction. Britain adapted, but adaptation meant accepting a smaller role. Former colonies stepped into independence as Britain stepped back, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. The empire did not fall in battle. It was priced out of its own structure. The aftermath reshaped the modern world. Global finance shifted centers. New powers filled the vacuum. Military strength became inseparable from economic capacity. Influence followed those who could fund stability, not just declare it. The lesson is uncomfortable but enduring. Empires can win wars and still lose the future. They can dominate maps and still be undone by balance sheets. Imagine ruling half the world, yet needing permission to fund your own survival. That is how the British Empire really fell. Not through sudden defeat, but through accumulated obligation. Debt turned victory into vulnerability. And the logic did not end there. Wars still end. Bills still remain. Power still follows whoever can afford the future. If you want to understand how today's world is shaped, you have to look beyond battles and speeches, and into ledgers and limits. If this story changed how you see history, subscribe for more cinematic explorations of power and economics, and share this documentary with others who want to see how empires really fall.